August 25, 1944. Normandy. The hedgerows still smoking from the breakout, and the chalk-white signboards begin to appear at dawn, nailed to shattered fence posts and bent lamp standards, each one stamped with a scarlet circle as bright as fresh blood. Red ball, it says, an arrow pointing east, then another, then a spray of them at every crossroads like a breadcrumb trail laid for giants. A convoy noses past a barn whose roof is sheared away, the first truck humming at a careful throttle, the second matching its distance to the front bumper like a metronome, the third and fourth and 50th vanishing into a low ground mist. No one is laughing. They are running a race against mathematics, against geography, against the law of diminishing momentum, and the only way to win is to turn a country road into a conveyor belt and keep it moving, day after day, night after night, miles after grinding mile. German commanders had mocked American logistics for years, calling it soft, calling it inefficient, calling it a circus of comfort, an army that dragged bathtubs and ice cream machines and mobile movie theaters across continents while real soldiers lived on crusts and courage. They would learn that the supposed softness was steel wrapped in kindness, that the comfort items were the surface of a machine whose true purpose was velocity, and that when the front outran the ports the Americans would not slow down. They would invent a highway out of nothing. They would call it the Red Ball Express. It would run for only a few months, yet it would prove that supply was not a support act, but the main event, the instrument that turned tactical victories into strategic collapse. The problem announced itself the moment the breakout from St. Lo became a flood, when Patton's Third Army gunned east and north with a hunger that stunned even its admirers. The Mulberry Harbor at Ardennes was still working, but its capacity was finite. Cherbourg had only just begun to breathe after the destruction the Germans left behind, and the French rail system was a spiderweb of twisted tracks and cratered yards. The Allied front had broken the walls of the Normandy box so quickly that the plan's elegant handoff from beach pipelines to repaired railheads evaporated in dust. There were fuel dumps in Britain and fuel ships off the coast and fuel cans stacked behind the beaches. But fuel at the front is the only fuel that counts, and armored divisions drink gasoline like deserts drink rain. So the Americans did something that looked insane until you watched it work. They took two roads and turned them into a one-way loop, a great clockwise artery of motion. Westbound was empty return traffic, eastbound was life. Trucks would load near the beaches and the inland depots, then run without stopping except to refuel, without detours, without improvisation, without the chaos that ruins speed. Military police established iron discipline at on-ramps. Engineers smoothed potholes. Sign crews hammered posts into bomb-hardened earth, and every red circle pointed forward, forward, forward. Pass no one, hold your interval, keep your light slitted and your mind awake. If a truck broke down, a wrecker dragged it off in minutes. If a unit hesitated at a junction, a white-gloved MP snapped them through like a conductor driving a furious symphony. The road itself became a factory line and the product was tonnage delivered to the point of contact. The Germans had long discounted American trucking, confident that the battlefield's hunger would outpace any road-borne lifeline. They calculated fuel burn, axle fatigue, tire failures, driver exhaustion, road capacity under rain, and they judged the enterprise fragile. They were right about the wear and the weather and the fatigue. They were wrong about what Americans do when the math is cruel. They simply add more trucks, more drivers, more shifts, more wrecker crews, more fuel points, more repair tents lit at midnight, more coffee pots boiling on potbelly stoves, more hands to grip more wheels. At the peak, the Red Ball Express pushed thousands of vehicles into motion and moved thousands upon thousands of tons per day. A torrent of gasoline, ammunition, rations, tires, gun tubes, engine blocks, and spare parts sluicing toward armored spearheads that never seemed to stop. The Germans thought in trains. The Americans, for a crucial season, thought in wheels. The convoy's heartbeat was the 2.5-ton truck, the GMC CCKW, the deuce and a half, a square-jawed, leaf-sprung mule with a canvas smile that never looked tired. Behind it rolled 1.5-tonners and fuel tankers and trailers stacked with jerrycans. the squat metal bricks that made gasoline modular and made refuelers into sprinters. A driver would brake for a quick top-off, a corporal would check a manifest with a grease-blackened pencil, and the convoy would surge again, headlights taped, cat eyes glowing like insects in a hedgerow lane. Maintenance crews learned to swap a tire in less time than it took to smoke a cigarette to the butt. Mechanics tuned carburetors by ear, changed clutches in mud, rolled beneath hot axles with the confidence of surgeons who have forgotten how to doubt. The Germans expected to measure American trucking by peacetime charts, to count axle loads and parse maintenance schedules and watch the line fail when drivers broke. But the line did not break because the drivers did not. They were very often young, often black, men of the quartermaster truck companies who had been told by their own country that their lane was narrow and who now shouldered a lane that carried an army. They ran the red ball because the line needed them, and they did it under discipline and danger and a fatigue that turned the world into a tunnel of road and red circles and the smell of gasoline on canvas. They were called hell drivers, and if the front asked for more, they simply shifted up and leaned in. German reports that summer and fall observed American columns moving with a relentlessness that made interdiction feel like interrupting a tide, a barrage balloon you could puncture but not deflate. The rules were simple because simple rules survive at 3 a.m. Eastbound only. No passing. Maintain interval. Obey the red ball. If you stop, you do not linger. If you break down, you do not wait in the lane. If you are tired, you grit your teeth to the next relay point and drink coffee so strong it feels like penicillin for the soul. There were relay depots where drivers traded loads and turned back, a rolling baton pass that kept the motion continuous. MPs stood at crossroads in rain that stung and wind that cut, their batons describing a grammar of urgency that made it possible for a truck from Arkansas to find the right road in a French night. At maintenance parks, wrecker crews used floodlights to make day out of darkness and patched tubes and retorqued heads while a countersman dashed parts across oily concrete. The drivers leaned on fenders breathing steam, listening to the engine's new note like a farmer listens to the sky. Then the truck rejoined the line and was once again a cell in an organism of speed. It is easy to misunderstand logistics if you have never watched exhaustion transmit across machines like current. A convoy is not a diagram. It is hunger with wheels. The front is hungry for movement. Guns are hungry for powder and fuses. Tanks are hungry for petrol by the minute. And every mile you drive is a debt the truck pays in grease and heat. So the Americans did something deeply unromantic and utterly decisive. They fed the trucks too. Gasoline points appeared along the lanes with the regularity of depots on a rail map. Tire depots stacked black rings to the rafters, the way bakers stack loaves before dawn. Tool crates were grubby treasure chests that kept opening and opening and opening, because a mechanic with the right wrench is the closest thing supply has to a miracle worker. German staff officers trained to prize the elegance of timetable rail stared at reports that read like nonsense. American truck columns had delivered fuel to units whose advance had outpaced the map. A division with empty tanks at noon was full again by dusk and probing a river line in the morning. A Corps artillery group whose ammunition dump was destroyed by airburst had, within 24 hours, a stack of crates taller than a farmhouse and was firing at a rate that would have bled a German railhead white. Interdiction helped, yes. Bridges fell under Stuka and 88, but temporary bridges rose under American engineer hands with the speed of refusal. The road net itself flexed like leather. Where rail is brittle, road is forgiving. If one artery clogged, detours appeared, signposts grew overnight, and the red circles multiplied as if painted by the weather. The Red Ball Express was not purely a triumphal story. It was also dust and rain and night terror, and the ache in a man's neck that makes him hate the horizon. Tires blew. Brakes failed on wet descents. A truck could meet a jittery guard at a blackout checkpoint and feel the cold wedge of a carbine's presence in the dark. There were accidents. There were wreckers bent into new shapes. There were drivers who fell asleep in the middle of a sentence and woke in a ditch, and medics who worked with quiet hands, and chaplains who rode shotgun at dawn because sometimes grace is a presence, not a word. But the line held because the purpose held. The purpose was simple: fuel and ammunition to the line, as much as possible, as fast as possible, for as long as required. As September folded into October, the distances lengthened, then shortened as new ports came online, as Le Havre breathed again, as rail lines knitted into function, as pipe flowed inland with gasoline at an industrial pulse. The red ball began as an emergency, and matured into a system, then made itself obsolete by success. That is the fate of good logistics, to be necessary until it is no longer needed. But in the weeks when the Allied armies could have starved upon their momentum, the trucks made sure they fed upon it instead. A tank battalion commander would later say that the Deuce and a Half was the most important vehicle of the war, because it carried the only ammunition that matters, the gasoline that turns intent into a rival. He was not wrong. German commanders who had once smirked at photographs of American mess halls and PX counters felt the weight of that misjudgment when their forward elements reported that American armored columns were refueling in farmers' fields with jerrycans stacked like masonry, that American artillery batteries were dragging their ammunition forward in long, dust-rimmed parades of cargo beds, that a crossroads interdicted at noon was passing trucks at 4, at 8, at midnight, as if the bombing had been a rumor. A captured staff planner, questioned after the fall of a river line, admitted a dawning horror, that the Americans had turned a whole nation's civil habit into a weapon, that their comfort with cars and roads had become a war-winning culture. It wasn't just trucks and drivers, it was maps in glove boxes, spare belts in tool drawers, the native language of distance spoken with an accent of asphalt. Behind the wheel, a 19-year-old private in a quartermaster truck company traced the red circles through the mist and said nothing. He had learned not to talk too much. He had learned to listen to the convoy's sound, the way a column's hum changes when a hill begins, the way tires talk when a crown is slick, the way an engine coughs before it sighs. He had memorized the posture of MPs who trusted their wrists more than their whistles. He had learned that the human eye will invent movement at 3 in the morning, that fence posts can be wolves, that taillights can turn into a hypnotist. He drank the thick coffee that cooks brewed with an artist's pride. He chewed the bread that tasted like a pause, and he drove again, because that is how the line stays alive. There were little kindnesses that did not make the tally sheets but made the system work. French children waving and then being shushed by mothers who remembered shell fragments, and then, when trust grew, waving again. A village baker who began leaving loaves at a checkpoint shack because he could not stop the trucks but he could sweeten their route. A mechanic who took a driver's letter and pushed it into a mail pouch as reverently as a priest tucking away a candle. An MP who carried extra cigarettes not for himself, but for the young corporal whose hands shook after a near miss on a foggy bend. These details seem soft until you realize they are lubrication, the morale that reduces friction at the scale of an army. By the time the German High Command began to adjust, the habit of speed had already found its long-term channels. Rail repaired behind the road and then exceeded it, pipelines unreeled and reduced the need for jerrycan pyramids, ports unfolded their cranes like steel flowers and swallowed whole shiploads of hope. But the red ball had purchased the time, and time is the rarest commodity in war. It had allowed the Third Army to lunge when it might have limped, had kept artillery in voice when silence would have invited counterattack, had fed pursuit when pause would have granted the enemy the gift of order. Against that calculus, mockery is weightless. After the war, survivors of German staffs begged their memories to explain how momentum had become avalanche. Some spoke of air supremacy, some of ultra-fast engineer bridging, some of decentralized initiative at the American tactical level, and they were all right in portions. But the thing that art cannot quite paint is the sound of a road at night when it is working the way a nation intended. That sound is tires like a long breath. It is gears like a hymn. It is headlights moving in ranks so disciplined they look like an instrument panel. And it is the sense, almost a smell, of purpose burned into steam. That is what the Red Ball Express offered, the intangible of continuous intent manifested in thousands of practical acts. The men who made it run rarely appear in the photographs that posterity loves, the victorious infantryman on a shattered city's steps, the tanker with goggles pushed up and a cigarette grinning at fate. The drivers stood at tailgates counting jerrycans, made pencil scrawls on manifests, kicked tires with a personal affection that embarrassed them to admit, then climbed back in and made another 100 miles disappear. Many of them were black Americans in segregated units whose recognition lagged behind their contribution, and yet there they were, carrying an army to a victory that would, slowly, help carry their country closer to the promises it printed on paper. The Red Ball Express did not just move fuel forward. It moved a nation forward in ways that are difficult to measure and impossible to ignore. German commanders who had once said with that old contempt that American soldiers would not fight far from their trucks learned too late the truth in their sneer, that American soldiers were never far from their trucks because their trucks were never far from them. Bond becomes advantage. Dependency becomes design. An army that knows its logistics knows itself, and the Americans demonstrated an intimacy with supply that transformed ridicule into fear. When a division commander radioed that he could attack at dawn if fuel arrived by midnight, and fuel did again and again, you can call that luck once. You cannot call it luck for a season. That is system, and system wins. By November, the red circles began to come down. New routes assumed the burden. The trains took back what had always been theirs. The pipeline sang its quiet song beneath mud and frost. The Red Ball Express faded, as emergency masterpieces do, into the operational background it had preserved. In bars and messes, the infantry and tankers raised glasses to battles with names that pinned to maps. The drivers slept. The MPs warmed their hands. The mechanics cleaned their nails with pocket knives and thought about the sound of a properly tuned straight six at idle. Some of them took the scarlet discs as souvenirs and hung them in garages back home. And sometimes, years later, they would touch that metal and hear the road again. What did the Germans finally see? They saw that logistics, far from an accessory, was the American center of gravity and the American weapon of choice, wielded with a craftsman's pride and an industrialist's scale. They saw that the convoy discipline they mocked produced tempo, and tempo is pressure, and pressure is advantage at every echelon, from a platoon leader who knows an ammunition resupply will actually arrive, to a corps commander who trusts the promise of gasoline enough to stretch his line like a whip. They saw that the supposed softness of American culture had been a rehearsal for endurance, that the abundance of peacetime had trained a generation to manage, to fix, to drive, to schedule, to trust the clock and the map and the road. And they understood, dimly at first, then with a sledgehammer's certainty, that the Red Ball Express had not been a patch over a flaw, but a revelation of character. The lesson endures. Logistics is not glamorous until it is the only thing that matters, and then it is everything. The Red Ball Express was not immortal because it lasted. It is immortal because it arrived. It made arrival itself a discipline, turned a million little arrivals into a continuous present, and showed a skeptical enemy what happens when a free society decides to be fast on purpose. The next time a commander sneers at supply, you can hand him a small red disc and ask him to trace an arrow. He will find the arrow pointing east, always east, toward the place where intention meets capability, where a road becomes a promise and a promise keeps. And if he listens, really listens, he might hear it, faintly at first and then loud, the sound of the night road when it belongs to people who have decided that mockery is cheap and delivery is victory. Tires hissing, engines murmuring, men awake far past the hour when doubt finally sleeps. The Germans had mocked American logistics, and then they heard that sound, and then they saw what it meant. The Red Ball Express passed them, and by the time it stopped there was nothing left to mock. Only the long, precise echo of an army that knew how to move and refused to do anything else. When the snow began to whisper across the hedgerows and the fires of autumn supply dumps turned blue with frost, the Red Ball Express was already history, yet its echoes filled every staff report on both sides of the front. In Berlin, weary logisticians combed through captured American manuals and depot photographs with the forensic intensity of men studying a superior species. They wanted to know how an enemy that treated soldiers to coffee and warm socks could somehow also conjure a steel tide that crushed divisions. They counted trucks, fuel depots, gasoline tonnage, but what they could not count was tempo, how the Americans had transformed movement itself into doctrine. At OKH headquarters, an aide to General Alfred Jodl read aloud a field report from the shattered 7th Army near the Seine. It described columns of American trucks as continuous as railway trains, yet without rails, each one obeying a rhythm invisible to the eye. A captured map showed red arrows etched from Cherbourg to Chartres, from Rennes to Reims, from Le Mans to Liège. "They have turned France into a factory," a colonel muttered, "a mobile one." The remark was meant as irony, but no one laughed. The Reich's supply philosophy had been built upon precision without flexibility, upon timetables that required obedience and rail lines that could not bend. The Americans, by contrast, improvised like jazz musicians. Same melody, infinite variations. When a bridge fell, they detoured. When fuel ran low, they cannibalized. Each truck was a soloist, yet together they produced harmony. German engineers, chained to the discipline of scarcity, could not comprehend abundance as a principle of war. In field interviews after the war, German generals still tried to explain their defeat in noble terms: superior numbers, air power, endless factories. But in unguarded moments, they admitted something deeper. They had underestimated the moral efficiency of a system built not on fear but on responsibility. Every Red Ball driver knew that behind him lay a chain of comrades counting on his wheels to turn. Every mechanic understood that a single replaced bearing could keep a battalion alive. Where the Wehrmacht punished error, the Americans repaired it. That difference, invisible to the eye, multiplied 1,000-fold on the road. By late 1944, the Red Ball system evolved into new arteries. The White Ball, the Green Diamond, the ABC line, each designated for different sectors, each humming with the same pulse. The signs changed color, the discipline remained identical. The Germans called these convoys ghost rivers, because they seemed to appear overnight, flowing through ruined villages and vanishing beyond the horizon. 50 caliber cartridges stitched into tarpaulin frames. More than one pilot returned to base muttering that the Americans even armored their gasoline. Inside those convoys, life condensed to repetition and ritual. Drivers learned to measure time not by clocks, but by the vibration of road seams, by the rhythm of bridges, by the scent of burning oil from the truck ahead. The radio blared swing music when reception allowed. Otherwise, there was only engine note and thought. Some kept small mascots on dashboards. Photographs, carved crucifixes, brass bullet casings turned into Lucky Charms. At rest halts, they unrolled bedrolls under truck beds, wrapped in tarps to keep out drizzle. In letters home, they described not glory, but continuity. "We move," one wrote, "and because we move, others fight." The enemy watched that movement with disbelief. Reconnaissance officers observed that American units could advance 50 miles and still maintain fuel parity, a feat German logistics could not equal even in peacetime. A Panzer Regiment commander near Aachen summed it in one exhausted sentence: "They drive faster than we can think." When Allied columns breached the Siegfried Line, many German commanders realized that the same trucks which had once fed Normandy were now feeding history itself, ensuring that no tactical setback could starve the larger victory. Winter brought new challenges: ice, darkness, mechanical fatigue, but also new ingenuity. Engineers fitted tire chains by the million, issued heated crankcase lamps, and turned depots into miniature cities of light under camouflage nets. At night, truck headlights glowed through blackout slits, twin amber eyes in infinite succession. The scene was so surreal that civilians along the routes began calling them fireflies. Children stood beside roads counting them until sleep overtook their arithmetic. Meanwhile, the German High Command attempted to resurrect the ghost of Blitzkrieg through Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive the world would call the Battle of the Bulge. Its premise rested on seizing Allied fuel depots before running out of gasoline. It was, in essence, an act of logistical desperation disguised as strategy. For every tank that advanced, supply columns lagged further behind. Captured orders revealed that German panzer units carried only 2 days of fuel. The planners had gambled that American indulgence in mobility would become their own undoing. Instead, the opposite occurred. When the snowstorm broke and the Germans punched their salient through thin American lines, the Red Ball veterans were ordered back into action. The convoys roared east again, through sleet and artillery flash, bringing gasoline to trapped units around Bastogne. Drivers ran without sleep for 48 hours, sometimes steering with one hand while eating with the other, convoy commanders following tire tracks buried under drifts. At one bridge blown out by retreating engineers, bulldozers carved a new ramp in under 4 hours while trucks idled like war horses champing at bit. Each delivery bought another day of resistance, another artillery salvo, another tank engine that refused to die. After the war, Allied historians catalogued tonnage moved. Over 400,000 tons of supplies in less than 3 months of official operation, equivalent to feeding entire armies daily. But numbers tell only a fraction of the story. The greater truth lay in adaptation, the instant willingness to improvise new methods without waiting for orders. A sergeant at a maintenance yard summed it best. The manual ends on page 100, but the war keeps going. That mindset, flexible yet disciplined, baffled German planners accustomed to doctrine carved in stone. Even Soviet observers, dour and unsentimental, admitted grudging admiration. A Red Army colonel visiting captured German depots after the war noted piles of seized American jerrycans and rations, meticulously stacked and labeled in German handwriting. "They study what they cannot make," he wrote in his report, "and they cannot make it because it requires permission to think." It was a cold compliment to a warm truth. Freedom of initiative is a logistical advantage. The post-war legacy of the Red Ball Express traveled home with its veterans. Thousands of African-American drivers returned to a country still hesitant to grant them equality, but unable to ignore their competence. The Army quietly desegregated transport units first, because the math refused prejudice. Efficiency had color, and it was olive drab. In civilian life, many became long-haul truckers, founding companies that stitched the continent together in peace as they had in war. Every interstate highway that unfurled in the 1950s carried echoes of their convoys, red circles invisible beneath asphalt, guiding commerce instead of tanks. Meanwhile, in Europe's ruins, defeated logisticians tried to rebuild. Under Allied supervision, German engineers studied American manuals and adopted lessons once scorned. When the Marshall Plan poured machinery across the Atlantic, those same rebuilt roads and rails became arteries of recovery. The first convoys of American aid trucks rolling through Frankfurt in 1947 looked hauntingly familiar. Identical engines, similar signs, the same efficiency. German civilians watched them with the same disbelief their officers had felt years earlier. Abundance again moved on wheels, this time bearing flour instead of shells. The Red Ball Express had become an exportable philosophy. Prosperity delivered on schedule. In war colleges, the campaign entered textbooks as a case study in improvisation. Staff officers diagrammed its routes on classroom maps, marveled at tonnage graphs, and drew polite arrows in blue grease pencil. But nothing on a chalkboard could capture the smell of hot rubber, the percussion of gravel under convoy tires, or the quiet conversation between a man and his engine in a midnight drizzle. Those who had been there said you could tell a veteran driver by his hearing. He could detect a bad bearing before anyone else, because after months on the Red Ball, you learned to listen the way a musician listens to a scale. Decades later, when journalists interviewed surviving German officers for memoirs, one asked a former colonel from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division what had impressed him most about the Americans. He answered without hesitation, their ability to act as if delay were impossible. That single sentence summarized an empire of supply. Where Germans accepted limits as natural, Americans treated limits as insults. The Red Ball Express was that attitude made visible, a refusal to wait. In museums today, you can still see one of the trucks, paint dulled to matte, its red circle emblem faded to rust brown. Children climb into the cab, touch the steering wheel, and imagine noise. The docent explains that this humble vehicle once carried 5-gallon cans that fed Sherman tanks, that its route stretched from Normandy to the Rhine, that without it the war might have frozen in the bocage. Visitors nod politely, but they cannot hear the hum. The hum was everything, the heartbeat of democracy in motion. The men who once mocked it learned too late that wars are not won merely by courage or cunning, but by circulation. An army is a living thing. Cut its arteries and it bleeds, but feed them, and it grows unstoppable. The Red Ball Express was nourishment turned mechanical, a manifestation of the simple idea that movement equals life. It did not have medals to pin, but it had results to measure. The proof lay in the relentless advance of fuel-fed divisions and the disbelieving eyes of those who watched them pass. When historians debate decisive factors of 1944, they speak of Overlord, of air supremacy, of Patton's drive, of Eisenhower's coordination. But underneath every triumph runs an invisible convoy, still rolling through memory, carrying the invisible cargo of competence. Logistics rarely earns applause because it does not explode. It sustains. Yet when the last German stronghold fell and the roads were suddenly quiet, even the infantrymen noticed the silence. "It's too still," one said, standing on a bridge near Remagen. He had grown used to the background murmur of progress. The road without trucks sounded like the ocean without waves. Years later, American and German veterans met at reunions where the talk eventually turned to supply. One gray-haired German admitted with a half-smile, "We never understood how you could afford so much motion." A former Red Ball driver answered softly, "We couldn't afford to stop." That was the difference. Necessity transformed into momentum, momentum into doctrine, doctrine into destiny. The story of the Red Ball Express ends not with an explosion, but with persistence. When those trucks rolled back across the channel after victory, they left behind more than tracks. They left a blueprint for modern warfare and a lesson etched in asphalt. That flexibility, backed by production, outlasts ideology every time. German commanders who had once mocked American logistics spent their later years teaching young officers the opposite lesson. Respect the road, respect the schedule, respect the mechanic. Even in peace, that creed survives, painted not in blood, but in red circles fading on the windshields of memory. Because somewhere, in the long corridor between Normandy and the Rhine, the sound still lingers. 1,000 engines idling in unison, headlights slicing mist, men awake at impossible hours believing in a simple, relentless truth. Keep moving. Deliver. Repeat. The Red Ball Express was not a miracle. It was proof that miracles are what happen when competence refuses to sleep. And long after the laughter of mockery had died, that sound remained. The mechanical hymn of a free people proving mile by mile that abundance itself can be a weapon. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the roads did not. The same convoys that had once carried ammunition to the front now carried refugees, food, and the strange, quiet weight of peace. The Red Ball Express had ended as a military operation, but it had begun something far larger, an awakening. American commanders realized that they had not simply supplied an army, they had supplied a world. The war had proved that speed, coordination, and mechanical reliability were not luxuries. They were civilization's arteries. The first chapter of that revelation unfolded in the ruins of Germany itself. The Allied occupation forces inherited a landscape where railways were twisted skeletons, where bridges hung like broken ribs, and where hunger was not a metaphor but a statistic. The U.S. Army, already fluent in motion, turned its transport corps into a humanitarian lifeline. Convoys that had once carried gasoline now hauled sacks of flour and medical kits, their canvas sides still faintly marked with the red circles of the express. German civilians watched them pass in silence, the same sound of engines now bearing mercy instead of menace. Children waved not because they understood geopolitics, but because trucks meant food, and food meant mourning. Within a year, the provisional government in Washington began planning something unprecedented, a logistical peace. The same planners who had scheduled convoy intervals across France were summoned to design supply routes across continents. Operation Vittles, the Berlin airlift, would owe part of its rhythm to the lessons of the Red Ball Express. The art of continuous throughput, of never letting the line go slack. Air crews replaced truck drivers, runways replaced highways, but the philosophy was identical. One-way loops, precise intervals, cargo unloaded without pause. The Luftwaffe had once learned that you cannot bomb velocity. Now the Soviets would learn that you cannot blockade it. By 1948, the American military had institutionalized what it called rolling logistics. Every depot became a node, every vehicle a promise, every schedule a heartbeat. Officers who had once commanded convoys in France now taught at Fort Lee, Virginia, where they drilled young lieutenants in the gospel of flow. Never let supply be static, never let a route grow cold. Charts from the Red Ball were pinned beside new diagrams showing global shipping lanes and air corridors. The same red circle appeared again on classroom slides, not as a nostalgic emblem but as a formula. Velocity equals security. Abundance equals diplomacy. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, creating the Interstate Highway System, a grid of asphalt arteries inspired directly by what he had witnessed decades earlier, first during a 1919 Army convoy across the United States, and later on the autobahns of conquered Germany. But it was the Red Ball Express that convinced him logistics was not just about transport. It was about unity. The interstates were built with defense in mind, yes, but also with the idea that a nation capable of feeding its cities and defending its coasts simultaneously could never again be caught unprepared. The road became strategy made permanent. Engineers who had kept the Red Ball running through French mud now oversaw civilian infrastructure projects. They designed rest areas where convoys of produce trucks could refuel and maintenance depots patterned after wartime service parks. The interstate mile markers echoed the convoy signposts, strict, sequential, mathematical. A driver on I-80 in Nebraska followed the same principle as a driver outside Le Mans in 1944. Stay in your lane, keep your interval, deliver on time. The discipline of war had become the grammar of prosperity. Yet the legacy was not purely mechanical. It was human. Among the hundreds of thousands who had kept the wheels turning, none carried the memory more deeply than the African-American veterans who had driven those convoys through Europe's ruined heart. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, many of them became advocates for civil rights, using the same quiet determination they had shown on the road. They knew what competence looked like because they had lived it. They knew that skill was colorblind long before their country admitted it. Organizations like the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and later the NAACP, found unexpected allies in those veterans, men who could argue not with rhetoric, but with results. "We delivered," one of them said years later. "That was our answer to anyone who said we couldn't." In the 1950s, as the Cold War deepened, the Pentagon turned again to the Red Ball blueprint. If nuclear war came, planners reasoned, ports and rails could vanish in fire, but trucks could move through chaos. The doctrine of distributed logistics was born, a network of mobile supply units capable of functioning even when command structures collapsed. War games at Fort Benning simulated convoy operations under atomic attack, and the manuals quoted a familiar line. "The road is the artery of survival." Even in the age of jets and missiles, the hum of a six-cylinder engine remained the sound of continuity. When conflict returned in Korea, it was fought on mountains instead of hedgerows, but the heartbeat was the same. The 52nd Transportation Truck Battalion, formed from veterans of the Red Ball, established main supply routes codenamed MSR Red, MSR White, MSR Blue, a literal echo of the European convoys. Drivers hauled ammunition and fuel through frozen passes, their vehicles wearing chains that clinked like metallic rosaries. Officers described the logistics flow as Red Ball on ice. And once again, mobility triumphed where terrain and weather conspired to kill it. A Chinese offensive could overrun a position but never stop the road for long. The same doctrine of perpetual motion saved battalions from starvation and kept the United Nations Army alive until airlifts could supplement it. Meanwhile, German officers rebuilding their new Bundeswehr studied these systems with fascination. Under NATO supervision, they adopted modular supply concepts and flexible routing, ideas once dismissed as American improvisation. Ironically, the descendants of those who had mocked the Red Ball now taught their cadets its principles. Flexibilität im Nachschub, they called it, flexibility in supply. A phrase that might have sounded heretical in 1944 but became gospel by 1955. The circle had come full. Industry, too, absorbed the lesson. American trucking companies expanded exponentially in the 1950s, mirroring the convoy culture that wartime necessity had refined. Dispatch offices resembled miniature command posts with wall maps, string lines, and radio logs. The first computer-based routing systems in the 1960s borrowed algorithms from military convoy planning. Every container ship, every warehouse barcode, every GPS delivery today owes a sliver of its DNA to those red-marked signs nailed to French fence posts. The Express had proven that control and chaos could coexist if the rhythm was constant. In the cultural memory of post-war America, the truck driver became a new archetype, half soldier, half pioneer. Movies and magazines romanticized him as the free citizen of the road, a man who moved goods while the rest of the nation slept. Few realized that this image had been born in uniform behind the wheel of a deuce and a half grinding through Normandy rain. The Red Ball Express turned logistics into legend. Even the slang survived. Hotshot runs, no stop hauls, convoy discipline. Civilians adopted the lingo without knowing its lineage. Every CB radio phrase in later decades carried an echo of those MPS standing at crossroads under drizzle, waving trucks through with luminous batons. Internationally, the influence spread through the Marshall Plan's reconstruction efforts. American advisors teaching supply management in Europe often cited Red Ball case studies. They explained to young French, Dutch, and Italian engineers that the secret of logistics was not machinery but rhythm. European transport ministries adopted convoy management systems for rebuilding commerce. When the first long-haul freight corridors reopened between Le Havre, Paris, and Frankfurt, their schedules mirrored the Red Ball timetables almost line for line. What had once been military improvisation had matured into continental commerce. Even behind the Iron Curtain, the legend seeped through. Soviet generals studied captured U.S. logistics manuals translated into Russian, marking passages with underlines of grudging admiration. Their own wartime supply system had relied on heroism over efficiency. The American model relied on organization over heroism. Stalin's planners could imitate the trucks, but not the culture of trust that made them run. In a nation ruled by fear, improvisation was a crime. The road could not sing if every driver feared the listener. By the 1960s, the last surviving Red Ball vehicles were being sold at surplus auctions, olive-drab ghosts reborn as farm haulers and construction rigs. Yet their lineage continued in the new generation of logistics equipment. Standardized pallets, intermodal containers, diesel rigs with sleeper cabs, automated weigh stations. Every technological leap traced back to the same revelation from 1944, that the shortest distance between production and power is an unbroken road. Eisenhower's interstate dream matured through that decade, paving not just the country but its psyche. Americans learned to expect motion as a right. A store without stock was unthinkable. A delay felt like disorder. The Red Ball philosophy, deliver, replenish, repeat, had woven itself into civilian expectation. Suburban supermarkets and just-in-time manufacturing lines were the grandchildren of the convoy. The road was no longer strategy, it was identity. When new wars erupted, Vietnam, the Middle East, the logistical model reappeared under different names: pipeline operations, line haul systems, forward support bases. Each was a reincarnation of the same truth. The front line survives on rhythm. Helicopters replaced trucks in jungle terrain, but the scheduling, the maintenance cycles, the fuel math, all were Red Ball derivatives. In Pentagon briefings, the phrase, "keep the ball rolling," was used without irony, a direct linguistic descendant of that 1944 code. The Cold War's massive exercises, like Reforger in West Germany, turned entire autobahns into simulated red ball routes. Convoys of modern trucks painted with fluorescent markings practiced delivering supplies under nuclear war conditions. West German children, watching them rumble by, heard their grandparents whisper that the Americans had once driven through here with red signs on their grills, bringing gasoline and liberation. Memory and machinery fused. Across the Atlantic, in corporate boardrooms, a quieter revolution unfolded. The discipline of wartime convoy management evolved into the science of logistics management. Universities established departments with names like Operations Research and Supply Chain Optimization. Professors drew flowcharts uncannily similar to red ball route maps. They spoke of throughput, queue theory, load balancing, all abstractions of what those wartime drivers had done by instinct and necessity. The world's new economy ran on lessons first written in dust and diesel fumes. Even art and literature found symbolism in the convoy. Novelists used it as metaphor for endurance, filmmakers as imagery of progress, poets as shorthand for destiny. A road, after all, is the oldest metaphor for human persistence, and the Red Ball Express had made it literal. Where ancient armies marched, modern armies rolled. Where faith once carried pilgrims, fuel now carried civilization. By the 1970s, veterans of the Express were aging, their stories half remembered by younger generations who knew highways but not hardships. Yet every time a trucker thundered past on an interstate ramp with dual headlights cutting the night, he was unknowingly repeating their ritual. Keep distance, hold speed, trust the road. The rhythm was immortal because it worked. The 1980s brought computers, satellites, and precision. The Defense Department launched the first global positioning systems to track convoys in real time. The Pentagon's Defense Transportation System linked sea, air, and land under one digital command, a direct descendant of the Red Ball's manual charts. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, American generals openly called their supply effort the modern Red Ball, moving 500,000 soldiers and millions of tons of cargo across Saudi sands in months. German officers observing the war noted with déjà vu that the Americans still fight on wheels. History had come full circle again, only faster. Even today, in the 21st century, the shadow of the Red Ball Express lingers in every humanitarian convoy and disaster relief column. When earthquakes strike, when floods sever rail lines, when airports close, it is always the trucks that arrive first, rumbling with the same patient urgency, drivers scanning hand-painted signs, engines idling in the rhythm of purpose. The modern logos are blue instead of red, but the philosophy remains identical. Keep moving. Deliver. Repeat. In hindsight, historians call the Red Ball Express the moment when logistics became destiny. It was not only a triumph of material power, but a moral statement that a free people, organized by trust instead of terror, could outproduce and outlast any tyranny. The Germans had once sneered that Americans were mechanics playing at war. In truth, the mechanics had mastered it. They had discovered that the shortest path to victory was competence, repeated until it became culture. Every modern convoy, every just-in-time factory, every humming interstate interchange carries a ghostly signature, a small red circle pointing forward. It stands for the day when engineers became warriors, when truckers became strategists, and when a nation learned that motion properly directed can defeat ideology. The Red Ball Express began as an improvisation. It ended as a civilization pattern. And somewhere, if you listen on a quiet highway night, you can still hear it. The hum of engines on wet pavement, the faint metallic rattle that sounds like memory itself turning its gears. The signposts are gone, but the direction remains. Forward. Always forward. Because once a people learns to move together with purpose, there is no blockade strong enough to stop them.